Welcome back to the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. Please review and subscribe to the Groundless Ground podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, YouTube, radio.com, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and of course find out more at groundlessground.com. I'm ready to go. How about you? If it is not by now fully apparent how much I love science, this conversation, more accurately, this rare chance to sit at the feet of a science master, is proof there is nothing more surprising and profound than the physics of space, time, information, and quantum reality. Cosmologist, physics professor, science activist, and author Anthony Aguirre generously discusses the intricacies of deep reality he shares in his astonishingly creative new book titled Cosmological Koans, A Journey to the Heart of Physical Reality. His book transported me into a multifaceted, explanatory world of story, mathematics, and mind-blowing truths about our cosmos. It should be at the top of everyone's gift-giving book list. Anthony is a rare jewel. In addition to his teaching and research, he has co-founded two seminal institutes, one supporting cutting-edge physics research, and the other focused on the evolution of artificial intelligence, biotech, energy, and climate disruption. Links to both websites are included in the show notes, and I urge every listener to visit these resources. The last part of our conversation probes the perils and promise of AI, a tidal wave of change every human should be both excited and concerned about. Anthony Aguirre, I'm deeply humbled that you would take any amount of your time to talk to me about your amazing book, Cosmological Koans, A Journey to the Heart of Physical Reality.
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so glad that you enjoyed the book.
Before we drop deeply into the book, you have such an interesting background. You were an astrophysicist first. Is that not true?
That's right. Well, I always really wanted to do cosmology, the universe as a whole. But I've taken a circuitous route through starting in astrophysics and then cosmology and then fundamental issues in physics. And I've just sort of gone where my curiosity is led, and that's taken me through a whole bunch of different fields. It's, I guess a little bit unusual for a researcher.
Definitely unusual. And I could see the whole path in the book because you touch on so many things, even things that you may not have meant, which I might actually bring up. There's so many threads in the book that touch on issues I'm actually very, very interested in, not just the sort of intersection of perception and mind with physical reality, but also the intersection of the way we understand the nature of reality through scientific principles, which also obviously come through our perception. This is a thread throughout your book.
Yes. It is amazing how much we can know and how much precision we can have in certain ways while still having these just yawning fundamental questions when you ask, okay, well, what does that actually mean? What is that about? What are you talking about when you say that thing? And ask 10 different people and get 10 different answers, even though the predictive power and the numbers and things are all so extraordinary with those theories. I find that really fascinating. Yeah, that was definitely part of the motivation for the book, to see that dichotomy.
The way you did it was so beautiful. You reached into history, and some of the characters I think are actual people from history.
I had a good time learning much more than I knew before, while still almost nothing about the world in the early 17th century. Well, a lot of the people in there are real historical figures. As I warn in the book, it should be read as historical fiction at very best and sort of parable, really, because I'm not a historian and what I glean from these is off random readings. But I had fun certainly trying to give it some feeling of history, give the reader some feeling of journey and place and time to situate it and make it feel a little bit like an adventure. Certainly it was an adventure writing it. I spent a lot of time actually zooming around on Google Earth, looking at the places where the different ones were taking place. I got a hard dose of wanderlust looking through the Tibetan parts and these little valleys in Tibet and so on, which I haven't really satisfied. Yes, so some of the figures are real, certainly Galileo, but also the Nur Jahan, who was a really interesting figure in India, the Zen swordsmen and teachers.
I wanted to just start by reading something from your book, if that's okay.
Sure.
This is from the very beginning, where you're sort of describing the method you used and why you chose the method. You write, the core aim of the book is to confront your subjective experience of the world with the objective world that is described so well by physics and revealed to be very different from what it seems. And co-opt the koan to gain some real understanding of the structure of physics and what it tells us about the true nature of our physical world. Koans are a world in which you're asked to go beyond your expectations, go beyond what you think you know, and investigate. And I felt like that's something I did personally throughout your book, not just with the little historical koan-like stories, but also the physics itself. For some reason, the way you described a lot of the complex physics principles, it was so much more understandable for me.
Well, that's good to hear, because it's very hard to try to get across some set of physical understanding while at the same time revealing how unclear that understanding is. What is understood and what you can kind of rely on in a physical theory versus what is then contentious or unclear or lacking in foundation. To do both of those at once is quite tricky. That's what's most interesting to me as a researcher. A lot of these questions are ones where through my life I thought, I really don't understand this, but everybody around me is kind of acting as if they understand it. So they probably do understand it, and I just don't really get it. It took me a long time to kind of realize that, no, they don't really understand it. There's this level of understanding that allows you to use the ideas practically and apply them, but mushiness underneath what people actually mean by these concepts, like entropy, like the meaning of quantum mechanics, and certainly like the more personal questions of identity and consciousness and what those things have to do with this external reality description. Nobody pretends that they understand consciousness, so at least there's that. But lots of people act as if they understand entropy, and it's much less clear.
I learned all kinds of things about entropy I didn't know. The first place I want to go, if it's okay with you, this is a little piece from one of the koans with Munenori Sensei. You write, with effortless focus, Munenori Sensei smoothly pulls the arrow to bend his bow. Released like a ripe fruit, the arrow glides. It races toward your heart. In the eternity of the arrow's flight, you wonder, what is this present moment? So the present moment is something that people in my profession, in psychology, are very into. And like what you've described of physicists, I know a lot of people who think they know what the present moment is. Mm-hmm. The present moment, the cosmic Tao, does it exist? Does it not exist? Is there actually a present moment?
Yeah, well, you probably by now know that I'm allergic to saying that there actually is or isn't something. It very much is a present moment. In so many ways, we experience it where it's all that we experience at some level. We've got memories, we've got predictions, thoughts, and imaginations about the future. I think mentally, it's clear that we construct the future possibilities, and we reconstruct past memories in this moment. We don't really read them back as if we're playing a movie or something like that has some fidelity to reality. There's a sense internally that we are constructing the future and constructing the past, and there's this fleeting experience of the now that is, as William James put it, flees once you try to grasp it. But then as experiencing beings, it's all that there is. And at the same time, physics tells us that if you look in the laws of physics or the laws of physics applied to the universe or any physics textbook, you'll look in vain for some physical definition of now. You can point to a time and say, oh, this is now, but what you're really doing is relating time according to some clock or on some plot on a page to an experience that you have. But there's no real sense in physics of now. All times are equally privileged. There's no particular one you can point to and say that it's now. So it's this immense gulf between now being kind of everything on the psychological, personal, subjective level and not existing at all on the fundamental physics level. And I don't think I would want to say that one of those is right and the other is wrong, that really there's no now and there's just an illusion of now that we feel as individual conscious beings. Nor would I want to say that the physics description of things is all an illusion. There's really just now, and everything else is an illusion or something like that. I prefer to take both of them very seriously and try to understand how to take both of them as seriously as they merit. But at some level, talking about slightly different things, that there is a reality and that we can look at it in this way and we can look at it in that way. And that's okay to do that. It's okay to say that this is real and this is real.
Should I view everything you said through the lens of classical physics or through the lens of quantum reality? Because it seems to me now means something very different depending which of these lenses you're actually viewing it through. Am I right about that?
From the physics perspective, I would say there's classical physics, and especially relativistic classical physics, where it's really hard to point to the now. And so in the sense that if you say now is this demarcation between what has happened and is certain and is fixed versus what has not happened and is uncertain and so on. So there's this kind of line that says before this line is the past and after this line is the future. What relativity tells us is that you really can't draw that line. Whatever line you draw, someone else will have an equally valid line that they will draw that can be different from yours. There's a deep tension between that idea that there's a now that is objective and relativity. Now, quantum mechanics has a sort of different structure when you first look at it, because regular quantum mechanics, that is not relativistic quantum mechanics, but non-relativistic quantum mechanics, has a time in it, like an objective time, just like Newtonian mechanics does. And you can say, before this, there's this wave function, and then after this, we measured something, and so the wave function is changed to this one. And that's really the way you talk about things in non-relativistic quantum mechanics. But that has to be reconciled with relativity. So it gets more complicated when you talk about relativistic quantum mechanics, and you get actually a pretty subtle and sort of confusing notion of now when you do that in what's called quantum field theory. But I would say that the idea that's kind of a mix between the two, that there is a sort of meaningful now and that everybody agrees on it, that is hard to support in physics. You are forced into this choice between a kind of real physics description in which the now is gone or a real internal description in which the now is everything. And what you'd like to have, which is to extend that feeling that you have internally to the whole universe, that you're not allowed to do. And that's what makes it so juicy, I think.
Even in neuroscience, the thing we experience as quote unquote now actually happened 3.5 milliseconds prior. The 90% of perception, which is under the hood, quote unquote, not the 10% conscious mind, already experienced it. And this is Libet's work. Even perceptually, we never experience the now. We're always experiencing the past, even though it feels like now.
And also, the different senses come in at pretty significantly different times, like tens of milliseconds separated. Our conscious mind is integrating all these over tens or even hundreds of milliseconds to make us feel like, yes, that sound, that picture were simultaneous, even though one of them had to travel through my arm. The feeling, the sound, the picture, they all took different pathways, but they feel like they're the same. Or that you can touch your toe and it feels like you're touching your toe, but obviously the nerve signal takes longer to get from your toe. This is always one of the most amazing things to me, is to see how we construct this understanding of reality so effortlessly, glossing over all these weird things that are happening, that we've constructed something that physically has one aspect to it, but we've glossed over that aspect in order to create the experience we have.
Another thread throughout your book is knowing itself. And one of the great characters that you use is the djinn. And I kept thinking, I wonder whether or not Anthony is using the djinn as a way for the rest of us to understand how a quantum computer might actually work, like what it might feel like to be that brilliant. Just talk a little bit about how you use the djinn, which is amazing through the book. There's so much you learn about what you can and cannot actually know.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with that. And I concocted it sort of as a figure. There's a classic thought experiment called Laplace's demon. This demon, this intelligence that understands the position of every particle and how fast it's moving and kind of perfectly can predict everything. So that was a bit of a setting off point for the djinn, something that had this immense measuring and calculational power, but subject it to some of the laws of physics. I've been thinking a lot in recent years about artificial intelligence. And so it very much crept in there as this computational being. It's a very powerful computation, that it can run computations, that it's very at home thinking about algorithms and what they do and how they act, kind of spawn off a little bit of itself to do some incredibly complicated calculation. The all-powerful predictor combined with the super intelligent AI, combined with a little bit of malevolence, right, that comes in, because the jinn is not a entirely kind-hearted figure. It's got its agenda that it's enacting, and its own personality. That jinn is there to illustrate there really are fundamental limits to what is possible. No matter how much technology progresses, no matter how much we allow them to be, advanced compared to the technologies that we have, that there still are going to be, in principle, limits to what they can do. When you think about technology improving, and if you read a lot of science fiction, you get this notion that anything is possible if we just understand science better and better and better. And certainly a lot is possible, and those fundamental limits are very loose in many ways compared to what we can do now. But it's really interesting, nonetheless, to see that in a real way, those fundamental limits do curtail both what we can do now and what we might do in the future. There are, ever surprising, I think, new understandings of limits that we just didn't think the universe would really have. Quantum mechanics is one example that nobody saw coming before quantum mechanics came. It's just taken for granted that we could measurements as precisely as we wanted, that we could gather as much information about something as we wanted. We could ask it any set of questions and get well-defined answers to them. Those turn out not to be true. Similarly, in computer science and in mathematics, we certainly thought, anything that is true in math, we should be able to prove. Turned out not to be the case. We thought if there's something that can be known, there ought to be a computation that tells us that thing. And if that thing happens to be something about how computer programs halt, that's not true. These weird fundamental limits to what can be known and done and proven, they're both humbling, but I almost find them in a way like reassuring, that there's kind of this backstop of kind of fundamental mystery to the world that is both frustrating, I guess, but also I find it oddly pleasing in some way, that there is this ineffability to the universe that is down there that we just can't do anything about.
In Buddhism, full-on awakening actually implies omniscience, that there is no barrier to knowing anything, because through all three schools of Buddhism, even though they're all very, very different, there is a sense of what I think, if I was a cosmologist, which I am not, but if I was, and I thought about the universe or even the multiverse, and I thought about the inconceivability of what infinity actually means, and then I put that together with what is ostensibly the beginning of our little teeny tiny corner of our universe, which may be one of many, but the beginning of it was some kind of singularity that was so small that anything that should have come out of it should inherently be entangled. And if that's the case, then nothing should be unknown on some level.
I think there's a strong suggestion that nothing is truly separate in that physical quantum mechanical sense, that everything is entangled. Whether you can use that to know things, I mean, there's all kinds of interesting places we could go talking about that. When I was first studying cosmology and physics, but also reading some Buddhist literature, there's this parable of the Buddha getting asked all these cosmological questions. Is the universe finite or infinite, et cetera, et cetera. He gives this reply with, he's got these few leaves in his hand, and he says, are there more leaves in my hand or in the forest? Typical Buddha fashion. And they say, the Venerable Buddha, there are more leaves in the forest than in your hand. And he says, so too, there are many more things that I know than that I talk about. So I'm not going to tell you the answer to these questions. So I remember feeling like, oh, come on, just give us the answers. Right? That notion of omniscience, I don't take it literally as a sense of physical omniscience, that there are secret mental processes that can tell us the answers to these cosmological questions. Science is the right means to get those answers. I do think, though, that on the other side, the level of understanding of reality, especially including its sort of internal and mental aspects, in the same way that spiritual practitioners and the Buddha, for example, didn't have the tools of modern science, didn't have the tools of modern cosmology, didn't have mathematics in the same way to describe it. In the same way, most working scientists have nothing like the set of interior understanding tools that the Buddha or other deeply realized people have. To imagine spending not days, not weeks, not months, but years honing those tools for understanding internal reality, and then the use of those tools by a clearly very brilliant set of people over thousands of years, I think has led to an understanding of reality that is sort of just as impressive as the external understanding of reality that physicists have discovered. Again, I like to take both of those as seriously as they deserve by dint of, how much careful human effort and thought has gone into each one. I don't really believe that if we just had the Buddha here, he would have an answer to what exactly string theory is, what is the nature of the multiverse, or something like that. But I would love to ask him a lot of questions, right? So
Buddhism actually has a multiverse. The Buddhaverse is a
yeah.
multiverse. Here we are using the word multiverse, and there may be listeners who have no idea what we're talking about. There's actually two versions. There's the multiverse with all the bubble universes, and then there appear to be infinite numbers of copies of us having other experiences. So I'm not sure if that's something you'd be willing to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's frustrating that the same word has been used for both of these because they're totally different things. The reasons for believing them are very different. The implications in many ways are different, although in some ways they can converge. The cosmological multiverse, most people already sort of believe in a sense, in that if you think of the observable universe, it would be weird and surprising if the universe just ended right outside what we can observe. I think most people accept that the universe goes on past what we see of it. We only see a certain amount because we're bounded by the speed of light, but there's more out there. And then the question is, at some level, how much more and how different is it outside of our observable universe than what we see inside? What modern physics and cosmology has indicated is the answers to those questions most likely are there's lots more, probably infinitely more, and it can be very, very different. And those shouldn't be that surprising, right? Why should we expect the universe to be small, and why should we expect it to be the same everywhere as it is in the region that we can see, even in its basic properties? There's this sort of notion, I think, that we inherited, I'm not sure from where, but that the universe is kind of small and what we see is what we get. To be fair, physics was very successful in extrapolating things that we can measure locally here on Earth to the solar system and the galaxy and the universe. It is the case that when we look at the constants of nature, like the strength of the electromagnetic force or the strength of gravity and so on, they appear to be identical throughout the observable universe. So we don't have any indication that, for example, the laws of physics or the constants of nature vary from place to place. It's worth taking that seriously, but keeping in mind that there's no real God-given reason to think that that's true everywhere in all of creation, that all of reality has these particular laws or these particular numbers and so on. Moreover, modern cosmology, the theories that best explain the observable universe that we see, including the theory of inflation and the Big Bang theory for our local region, really strongly suggest that there is this huge diverse set of properties and scales and time scales and volumes out there beyond the observable universe. I find it super interesting that modern physics has pushed us there, even though we wanted to keep the universe simple as physicists. We tend to like simple models for things. But we nevertheless got forced to this much more open and complicated one. But it's one that isn't that weird, as illustrated by the fact that many ancient cosmologies, like the Buddhist cosmology, thought very much this way, that there are huge timescales, huge diversity, tons of planets, many galaxies and universes, words that are hard to translate exactly into modern terms, but not some tiny little corner that is all of creation existing for 6,000 years or something like that. A much, much bigger vision. I think it's fascinating and interesting, but it's only weird from a certain perspective, I would say. It's weird from the perspective of thinking that everything is what we see. All time is just like the time that we're aware of, and all space is just the space that we're aware of. So in that way, I think the cosmological multiverse is fascinating, but not that surprising, honestly. It's kind of radical and people get all upset about how strange it is and how big it is and so on. I guess I feel like there's nothing to be terribly afraid or shocked by there. The quantum multiverse, in some ways, hits closer to home and undermines our normal sense of reality a lot more. Quantum mechanical theory, the many worlds version of quantum mechanics, says every possible thing that could happen happens. And it's all about, in some weird sense, some of them happening more really than others. If they're possibility A and B, the universe does both, but there's some sense, and this comes in mathematically as the so-called amplitude of that branch of the quantum wave function, There's some sense in which one of them is more real than the other, that we're more likely to experience that one than the other one. Now, making sense of what exactly that means, the more real and more likely to experience one than the other, has been almost impossible for me over the years, which is why I'm reluctant to accept this version of quantum mechanics. Other people are happy to accept this version of quantum mechanics. I still have a lot of trouble with what those probabilities mean, how to think of them, what the levels of reality mean, and so on. But whatever issues you have with this version of quantum mechanics, all versions of quantum mechanics have weird issues with them. What there isn't is a version of quantum mechanics that is just normal and makes sense with quotes around those words, right? Every version of it says something very, very strange about reality. So you get to choose which strange aspects you want to accept. When you really take that view of reality seriously, it's really strange and counterintuitive. In the book, I get into some of the really strange things that seem to happen if you believe that. For example, when faced with a life and death situation, inevitably you both die and you live. Now, how do you think about that? Because we're used to thinking about one physical body and we're inside it in some sense. This quantum theory is telling us that we're constantly splitting into gazillions of different versions, but we only get to experience one of them. But if there's the splitting, but one of them continues on existing and the other one stops, is dead, doesn't have an interior view of the world, we can't go that way. So we sort of have to go in one of the branches of reality where we continue to exist. And if you take that seriously, then you're led down this weird path of thinking that we can't die in some way, because whatever would befall us, some version of us will go on living. And the more you think about this, the more weirded out you get. I don't provide, unfortunately, any definitive answer to this. I think we're all stuck with reality is weird, and it may say some really weird things about our existence. Some sets of ideas that we might choose to believe, when we put them together, lead to some pretty weird conclusions about our own existence.
From the moment I heard about many worlds, I didn't have any problem with it. I think I don't take all of existence as personally as most people do. And this is another thread through your book, deconstructing the whole notion of information itself. I have always had a sense that on some level, the only thing this thing I think is me must be is a bunch of information. And it seems like information could do a lot of things.
Yeah.
It leads me to wonder why, since people are building quantum computers and they're actually calculating in more than one universe, why they're not learning more about the way information itself causes decoherence. It's always bothered me, the idea that an observer, quote unquote, is a person observer. It just seems like the observer has to be something other than the perceiver.
This gets deep into the issues of how to think about quantum mechanics. You know, the theory itself, when you look at what happens when you take a quantum system and kind of let it interact with a more complicated, bigger system, the natural evolution of that combined system, according to Schrodinger's equation, which tells you how the quantum state evolves, tells you that it evolves into a superposition, both versions of that bigger, more complicated system. So the theory itself just tells you what you would call a measurement, in the sense that you have a device that interacts with a quantum system, turns into those two different devices. And there's a very rigorous way of understanding when you can talk about those two devices as kind of separate versus the decoherence that you mentioned, separate versus a single quantum system. In other words, that all the quantum nature of that superposition has gone away, and there's no physical question or quantity that you can calculate that will tell you that they're part of the same quantum system. But all of that would be true if we were talking about a classical system with a probability distribution describing it. So imagine that there's a little physical system that I'm interested in, but I just don't know exactly what state it's in. I give different probabilities to the different states it might be in. And then I use my physical theory to evolve that little system. It now has to evolve of probabilities rather than an actuality, but just probabilities. And I can evolve that system interacting with some other system, a bigger system, a more complicated system. And what that will evolve into is probabilities for the whole thing going one way versus probabilities for the whole thing going another way. In just the same way, both outcomes will be there in the equations. And the equations will tell you, this one is maybe more likely than that one according to the probabilities, but they're both there in the same way. And then I might say, oh, but when I look, I find that actually this is the one that happened and not that one. And that answer in that version was there all along. Like the system had a state all along. I just didn't know what it was. But in evolving my understanding of the state, I ended up in the situation where my understanding split into two possibilities. One way of viewing quantum mechanics is it's just the same way. It's not really about the system itself. It's about our understanding of the system or our knowledge of the system. And it's fine for our knowledge to split into two different possibilities. One of them be real and one not. That happens all the time. Don't know whether your child is at school or at home. You can give different probabilities to them. You look inside and you see that they're home, and one of those possibilities disappears and it doesn't cause you any problem. One view of quantum mechanics is it's just like that, and the other view takes the state much more seriously and says that they're both real. It's amazing to me that we've managed to go for 100 years and not really understand this. Such different conceptions of the fundamental basic nature of reality. Part of that, to be fair, is because we haven't tried very hard. We spent between, say, 1930 or so and 1990 forbidding anybody to talk about this question. It's the weirdest thing. Basic physics question, basic understanding of reality, weren't allowed to talk about it or think about it. Strange history of science issue there. But now we're talking about it more, and I think that's gotten really interesting from the physics perspective. People are just comfortable with it at different levels. Some people are profoundly uncomfortable with the splitting of realities. Some people are profoundly uncomfortable with the idea that there isn't an objective reality, that there's just our knowledge about it, that there's just our information about it. And who has that information? If we're made of information, how can information have information about information? What I think is becoming more common currency in the physics world is that information is just as important and real as energy or matter. That for a long time we've thought about things are fundamentally made of stuff, energy and matter, and information is this extra thing that we might have, that people have, this gloss on that more fundamental stuff. It's pretty clear now that if the stuff isn't totally unimportant, if it isn't all information, information is at least as important, at least as fundamental and as integral to our understanding of reality as the stuff is, or the energy. So I think that's been a big change. And part of that is because of what you suggested, the quantum information theory is no longer this weird esoteric topic, but is being built into technologies and we really have to understand it to understand these technologies and what quantum computers do and how they can operate. It's taken those quasi-philosophical questions and made them very current in terms of technology, and that I think has really helped.
Do you think this is because people have not thought of information as something physical? To me, there's no distinction between stuff and information. Information must be physical, mustn't it? It's not unmanifested.
What's tricky is I think you can talk about information both in a sort of subjective and an objective way. One of the koans, I talk about probability and how you think about probability. One version of probability is don't know, that I have my probabilities for things. I don't know almost anything for sure outside of this room that I'm in, but I assign probabilities to them. And I accept a kind of fact of the matter of what they're like, and I just don't know. But you can also talk about probabilities being commonality or relative frequencies of things, that if I roll the dice, 1 million times, that about 1/6 of a million times, the die will come up 1. And so there's this very operational sense of I have lots of events that are comparable. I count up how many turned out one way, and I divide, and I get a probability. And those are very objective feeling in the sense that there's this actual counting. It's not about my ignorance of something. I don't matter in that definition, right? It's just objective reality of how many there are of this versus how many there are. And these two notions of kind of subjective and objective probability, again, there's like whole schools of thought fighting it out about which is the right way to think about probability. It's almost certainly both are useful in certain contexts. Information has that same duality to it. You can ascribe information to the probabilities that I hold about something, but you can also ascribe information to sort of comparing the number of ways something could be versus a subset of those that you've picked out for some particular reason. In just the same way, if I have a whole bunch of possibilities for a set of coin flips and I say, I just observed the first coin flip was a heads, That's information in this very specific mathematical sense. And I can think of that as because I've got all these possibilities laid out and I've selected a set of them, and I can count how many of this set versus how many possibilities there are and ascribe information to that. Or I can say, I know that one coin was a heads, but I don't know the other one, so I'm ignorant of those, and think about the probabilities of things as my ignorance and ascribe information to that. So it's like there's information, it's the same formula, it's the same amount, but it's very different views of the status of that. Is it a subjective thing that has to do with me as an observer, as an agent, or is it an objective thing having to do with the world out there? It's fascinating how, again, these can be the same mathematics, the same very detailed understanding used rigorously to win monies in casinos and calculate how a quantum computer works, but such different interpretations and such different implications about what we're talking about in reality.
I'm wondering if I should tread on the topic of intelligence in two different ways. You're a cosmologist. Do you have a sense that there is some kind of intelligence in the way the cosmos is functioning?
I guess it really depends on what intelligence means here. I mean, I see two sort of basic aspects to the universe as we think about it. There are senses in which the best way to understand the universe is to say there are rules and there's stuff, and the stuff follows the rules. If I just knew the rules and I knew the state, I'd use the rules to tell me the state at all later times. If I knew that well enough, then I'd know everything. That's the sort of Laplace's demon, or the genie in action. But we also know very clearly that that's almost never what we actually do. When we want to know why does this cup go up in the air, well, the reason is because my hand grasped it and lifted it. The reason that that happened is because I thought, oh, I'd like to lift that cup in the air as an example of goals and intention and so on. Physics has this allergy to thinking, and evolutionary biologists are even more vociferous about this, that you're not allowed to think about goals and intentions. And there's a reason for that, of course, a historical reason. But it's just clearly true that the best way to say why this cup went up in the air is a chain of reasoning that starts with me deciding in my mind to lift this cup into the air. So I think there are irreducibly these two ways of looking at the universe in terms of evolution of stuff and laws that in a law-like way describe how the universe goes from one state to another, and that there are goals and intentions, and the explanation for why something happened is because there is a goal and intention that is being aimed at in some way. Everybody agrees that when you get to like biological systems or humans or other thinking systems and lots of human creations like computers, that thinking about goals and intentions is the right way to think about, certainly the most useful way to think about why they're doing what they're doing. Now, it's not the right way to think about what happens when you jump off a cliff. The right way to think about that is the laws of physics and gravity, and whatever your goals are, they're going to be smashed to bits at the bottom of the cliff. There are limits to goals and their pursuit that are limited very much by the laws of physics. But explanations for a choice, you will just not find in the fundamental laws of physics. Now, there's a question of kind of what is the character of the universe as a whole? Like, are there senses in which the sort of reality as a whole or the universe as a whole has this more intentional aspect to it? I'm certainly suspicious of thinking that there's some sort of intelligent being out there guiding the universe in some way towards some outcome. At the same time, there's a deep sense in which, as is discussed in many places in the book, that the structure of reality is not just the universe telling us what it's like, but this two-way street of it telling us a little bit what it's like and us telling us, okay, that's how I describe you, and this kind of interaction that leads to our conception of reality. And so insofar as reality is that co-creation, it kind of necessarily has bits of both things. It has aspects of those brute physical evolutionary laws and of the goal-driven and directed and intelligent behavior. It's a very subtle question that doesn't have a simple answer other than it depends exactly really what you're asking, and it's complicated.
Just to deepen that a little bit, nobody knows what consciousness is. Just like that, nobody knows what existed before the Big Bang.
Yeah, if there's even a meaning to the question.
That's surprising. The meaning to the question would be Can something come from nothing? What is nothing? Is nothing actually nothing? Your whole book is kind of about this.
Yeah, I thought that I would, but I somehow didn't get into as much in the book, is this cosmological question of kind of the beginning. I do talk about the notion of eternal inflation, in which the universe as a whole is kind of eternal, and our observed universe and our Big Bang universe is just this one little kind of bubbly bit of it that's been around for 13.8 billion years. But before that, there is a state of the universe that could go back as far as you like, maybe infinitely far back. There's this kind of tongue-in-cheek poetic description of that in the description of this Tonka painting. There is a theory in which the history of the universe could sort of go arbitrarily far back in time, and the Big Bang was just a transition from this previous sort of form of existence to a different one. But I think that doesn't entirely avoid the question, because even if that physical system went indefinitely far back in time, you can still ask, why is it the way that it is? Why did it have the boundary conditions that it does? Why does it have the number of dimensions as it does? What is space-time coming from? We don't have quantum gravity really, but we have a sense that space-time as we know it is probably an approximation to some more quantum mechanical thing. If it is, then whatever that quantum mechanical thing is, it doesn't have, by definition, space and time in it. So questions like what happened before there was that deeper quantum mechanical thing may not make sense at all. There's a lot that's unknown here. And we have this very concrete Big Bang model for 13.8 billion years that does so well. It's getting boring, actually, in cosmology in a lot of ways, because this model does so well, and it's really hard to find things that it doesn't account for in some way. While at the same time, what happened before that is so unknown and opens up so many interesting, strange possibilities, both in the time direction and the direction of, I hate to use the word more fundamental description, but a description from a different, more quantum aspect of where space and time come from that are wholly unanswered. There's a simple answer to what came before the Big Bang, which is, oh, inflation came before the Big Bang, and there was an inflationary period. And I think that's a useful answer because most people don't know about inflation and they don't think about it, and they think of the Big Bang as the beginning of everything. That's a slightly outmoded way to think about it now. The question still remains, is there a beginning to all of it? Is the universe eternal? Is it finite? How do we think about that? Both answers are weird. As a grad student, I had an amazing advisor who pointed out to me, it's like an appendix in this book by Kant called The Antinomies of Pure Reason. He beautifully proves why the universe has to be finite in time. And then he beautifully proves on the next page why it has to be infinite in time. And then he proves why it's finite and why it's infinite in space and so on. And so it's the cool intellectual virtuosity of it as exhibiting the limits of our reason. But also, and this is what is actually inspiring, I think, as a physicist, is that the arguments that he gives, you actually see where they go wrong. Once you understand general relativity, you can see just because something is finite doesn't mean that it has a boundary. You can have something that is finite but without a boundary. So that argument just kind of falls apart in a way that a brilliant person couldn't really conceive, but now we can because we have these new tools. The lesson I take from that is both one of humility. There are these deep questions that it's very hard to get a handle on and they're confusing and so on, but also inspiration that sometimes we do actually make progress on them, that we can get a set of physical and mathematical understanding that reposes those questions in a way that we can see, oh, that argument just went away. I get to think about a more interesting, deeper question in new context with a new set of tools. And that I find really exciting. So the beginning of the universe is at some level one of those questions that I think we're getting to repose it in more and more interesting ways. And the simple idea of the universe sprang into being out of nothing, yeah, it's confusing for a reason. It probably doesn't make any sense. And we have to think about that in a new way, but we sort of can. We're getting tools to be able to do that.
You just did a beautiful job of bringing together two concepts that I wanted to use to talk about artificial intelligence, which I know is one of the areas you're interested in. And I think a lot of people are very confused about AI in all kinds of ways, even psychologically. You know, the whole idea of it is frightening for a lot of people. Maybe what we could do is have you talk about artificial intelligence, where it is now, where we think it's going from the perspective of our relationship to it and it to us, what that might end up looking like. But also the same dialectic you just mentioned with Kant. People have very strong opinions about this. And my sense is neither of the extremes are true. There's something in the middle. Maybe you would be willing to talk about how you feel about AI.
It's a long story, but I'll give it a shot. I think first it's important to contextualize that what we call intelligence isn't one thing. Again, one of those things that we have it. First, we tend to take it for granted somewhat, although we tend to want more of it in practice. We take for granted that it exists and kind of what it is. We see it as this capability, but of course, it's many, many different things and many different capabilities. Once we started developing computers, we found that there are certain capabilities that we call parts of our intelligence that computers can do really well, like way better than us, adding big numbers together, trivial for computers, and other things that are trivial for us and incredibly hard for computers, like picking up a glass without breaking it. Still, no robot can really do that very well. Artificial intelligence and the whole computer field trying to get machines to do the sorts of mental tasks that humans do has really dramatically reconfigured the way we see human intelligence. We see that there are certain things that we're amazingly good at. A lot of them are things that we kind of evolved to be good at, and ones that we're very poor at, and that we can somehow, somewhat miraculously, I mean, it's always been a miracle to me that humans can do complicated math. Why can we do that? It would be nice to be able to do it better, but there are many facets of intelligence, and that machines will probably develop those facets in a very different way than humans did. They're already way better at humans in some things, and will probably be worse at humans in other things for a long time. That there may be aspects of intelligence that we're largely missing because we're totally taking for granted that will be very difficult to get in artificial intelligence. In particular, what we're beginning to appreciate is what you might call robustness. Humans, our actions, our intelligence, our mental processes are, on one hand, very free and unconstrained and creative. Most of us are able to encounter a large variety of new situations and deal with it at some level. But we also have this incredible robustness that is part of the same process. We have an incredible understanding of this very, very complicated set of constraints that we call common sense or something like that, that are just built into us. And when you ask a human to go to the store and get something, they don't walk straight to the store, like through people's yards. You know, there's so many constraints that go into the way we actually choose to do any given task. And we don't think about them. They're just there implicitly. But you realize when you try to design artificial systems, they don't necessarily have all those things. That if you just say, get me something from the store as fast as possible and don't give any other constraints, you're going to have a disaster because they don't have all those things. Part of the concern with artificial intelligence is because it's being created by this very different pathway, not evolution.
Right.
Millions of years of interaction with this complicated biosphere that is honing us to be this very creative and robust thing that can go into all sorts of situations and make sense, but rather design it to do very, very specific things very, very well, that it's going to have very different properties. And it's kind of a trite thing that computers lack common sense, but I think we're beginning to appreciate the gravity of that situation as you contemplate machines that are really, really effective at what they do, really, really intelligent in a way, but don't have that robustness, that don't have that very, very complicated interlocking set of constraints operating on them that have come from many, many different places, including evolution and culture and all sorts of things, that there are all kinds of disasters and failure modes that can happen. And we see that in the primitive systems we have now, and I think the worry is that we're going to see it more and more as time goes on. The second, I think, is this lack of understanding about what consciousness is. Has been pretty okay at some level for a long time. I mean, it's inconvenient not to know when a patient on the operating table is definitely not experience anything versus just not able to move. Like, that's really important. But there aren't that many other contexts where we're really like, well, are they conscious or not? We assume most people are conscious when we're talking to them. This could start to become a big deal when we start to create machines that are in some ways as intelligent as us and in some ways as complicated as us. Are they experiencing something? Is there something that it's like to be that machine? Is there an inner light to those things? We really don't know how to approach that question. People assume vastly different things. There are lots of people that take the view that if we can make something that acts kind of like a human, that it's going to have the same sort of consciousness that we do. And then there are other people who say nothing that is ever made of silicon is going to have any consciousness or any interior sense. This, I think, is steadily going to become not a philosophical, but a really practical question that we have to know the answer to. And that's scary. So that's another one that troubles me. I think we're getting to the point where we're going to need answers to a question that we really don't know how to get answers to, and that most people are not even trying to answer. And we're even a little bit forbidden from talking about the question in some way. There's a real culture in physics that if you talk about consciousness, oh, you're out to lunch talking about consciousness. Leave that to the neuroscientists, who also aren't allowed to talk about consciousness. So, like, nobody's allowed to talk about consciousness. And yet, what happens when there's a technology that we say, okay, we're going to replace part of your brain with this machine? Are you going to feel the same? Suppose there's a personal assistant that is really, really intelligent. It's smarter than your kid. Do I have to treat it well? I don't know.
You're actually treading on the territory of, does it have a self? Although I have to say, to me, intelligence does not necessarily impute a self.
Right. There's intelligence, there's having a self, there's self-consciousness, there's awareness, there's awareness and experience that has like a positive or negative valence to it, like that is suffering or enjoying. They're all packaged together in us in a very familiar way. And the self is connected with the suffering, is connected with the experience. But they're not really the same things. And we don't know whether we can have a machine that experiences but never experiences things that are good or bad, or that is intelligent and doesn't experience anything. I think we just don't know which of these things necessarily go hand in hand. And it could be that intelligence requires self, requires experience, requires suffering and gladness. I find it troubling that there isn't more intense effort to really be honest about the fact that we would like to understand this and that these are legitimate questions, which are really hard from the standpoint of science to get a grip on. Asking whether something has that inner light, that like awareness, is very hard when you can't ask it a question. When you think about a mouse, I think most people believe that it's like something to be a mouse, but it's very hard to prove. You can't really talk to the mouse and ask it the same way you can ask a human. What happens when there's something that is complicated and maybe you can even talk to, but you just know came from a very different history and development pathway than a biological creature? I think there's a lot of interesting fertile ground there that we sort of need to get over the taboo of talking about, because it's no longer an esoteric philosophical question that we can throw up our hands about. We're going to have to make important moral decisions on the basis of it. Maybe AI will just stall out and machines will never get much better than they are now, and we won't have to worry about it. We'll just have to worry about the ethics of genetic engineering and nice, easy questions like that. But I suspect that we're going to really be confronted with moral questions that hinge on our beliefs about consciousness and awareness and suffering and self and all these things, and how they fit together in machines and humans and maybe hybrid systems. And I don't think we're at all prepared for that.
Biological creatures have had one thing they've had to contend with since the very beginning, which is their own existence and death. That's a biological evolutionary constraint that an artificial intelligence system would never have to deal with. Even a single-celled organism or even a cell in the body is driven to eat. It has to get nutrients. It has intention for its existence, even though it has no neurons, it has no brain, it doesn't have thoughts. A lot of science fiction will impute this onto artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. But this is something that I don't know AI systems will ever experience. Maybe about electricity, I don't know.
Yeah, this is an interesting question, because I think there's an argument that says, well, there are all these drives like survival and desire for power that humans have that artificial intelligences won't. And we shouldn't, impute those drives to them, whether or not there's an experience of those things. On the other hand, I think there are good arguments that there are certain drives that an intelligent agent will necessarily develop. Suppose you create an incredibly intelligent and capable robot and you tell it to go to the store and buy you a loaf of bread. That's its goal, and it's really effective at its job. And on the way, someone tries to stop the robot, says, hey, stop, don't go any further. Mm-hmm. The robot is not necessarily going to listen to that because its job is to get a loaf of bread. Now, suppose someone gets mad and tries to turn off the robot. Well, the robot can't get the loaf of bread if it's turned off. Right? So the robot does not want to be turned off, not because it's evolved to have some self-preservation instinct, but because it can't accomplish its job if it's turned off. And you can think of other things like this. Someone came to you tomorrow and said, it's a time traveler, say, they know about the future. They tell you this company can't exist. This company is going to destroy the world. You have to take care of it. You're convinced of this. It's the most important thing in the world to cause this company to cease to exist. What are you going to do? You're going to try to do things like acquire money or influence or power. There are all these things that just toward the goal that you have suddenly decided it's the most important thing in the world. When you think about it that way, you start to get pretty worried, because if we have very powerful computer systems that suddenly want to become rich and powerful and not be able to be turned off, now we're down the whole science fiction disaster scenario. On the one hand, I agree that we shouldn't anthropomorphize and just assume that machines will be like us. At the same time, I think there are potentially dangerous general properties of intelligence, like you will develop subsidiary goals to any primary goal. And some of those subsidiary goals may be pretty antisocial, just like they are in humans and corporations. That seems like a general property of intelligent systems that we will have to be very mindful of as we make systems much more powerful. At the same time, it's kind of wrong to say that a corporation has a drive to continue to exist or has a drive to get more powerful. It doesn't have it in the same way that we do, but as an intelligent agent, it does have those things. It's a subtle question. You don't want to attribute those feelings necessarily to something that doesn't have them, but that doesn't mean it's not dangerous.
Do you think people should be worried about the direction in which artificial intelligence is evolving without scientists and engineers asking these kinds of questions?
Yes. Not that I think the default is necessarily a disastrous one or something, but with AI and also for genetic engineering and some other technologies, there are going to be big, big changes. And when you take any system and make big changes to it, there's no real good reason to believe that those changes are necessarily going to be for the best. It worries me sometimes. If you go through the exercise of imagining heaven, utopia, what is that like? Pretty hard to come up with something that is really genuinely great. Whereas it's really easy to think of the opposite. There are lots of ways for things to go wrong, fewer ways for things to go really well. And the reason we've ended up where we have, in a pretty good place in a lot of ways in the world, very bad in other ways, we haven't blown ourselves up yet. We're not having so many wars anymore. We've made a lot of social progress. It's not because that happens by default. It really doesn't. But because we've made a lot of choices collectively with the goal of making our lives better. But that's taken a lot of work. Worrying about how the future is going to be is a crucial part of that. If you don't think about how the future can go off the rails and avoid those things, then they just may happen. If you don't think about where we want to go and kind of aim things in that direction, I think we're unlikely to just find our way there in any highly likely sense. I don't think people should tear their hair out and run around thinking that the killer robots are coming any second. But I do think that they should worry about the fact that AI is going to be changing things a lot. We're going to have to make a lot of important, difficult decisions, and we better understand what the decisions are, what our choices are, and how we're going to make those choices as a species. Not despair, but worry, I think, in a good way.
I think people will be happy to know that your institute is doing some work in this area.
2 institutes that I'm associated with. The Future of Life Institute, which is thinking about technology and technological change. And that one is thinking a lot about artificial intelligence and the sort of the long-term future of it and worries we should be thinking about and opportunities and so on. It's a big job.
I'm glad someone as intelligent and open-minded and creative like yourself is doing this, particularly someone who's willing to be okay with not knowing.
If I could give one message, it's okay. There's so much suffering that happens internally from people feeling like they have to know and be sure of things, that they have to know the right answer. And then once they do, they have the right answer. And whoever else has other answers are wrong, and we have to have conflict with them. The universe is such a deep and mysterious and incomprehensible place. It's very much worth trying to get more of those answers, but there's nothing wrong with not having the answers to so many things. To me, that's where the fun is. That's where the excitement is. And getting those answers, not having them. Having the answers is not that exciting. Going through that journey of learning them and understanding them and pushing forward and back that process, that's what's exciting. And if you feel like you have to have the answers already, or if you've got the answers already, you're missing out on all the fun, all the interest. Yeah, ignorance. I highly recommend it in certain ways.
You've been so generous with your time.
Okay, well, this has been a great pleasure, and you've brought so many great questions for us to talk about, so thank you.
I have been interested in all these things for so long. It's very difficult for common people to have conversations with the people who are at the forefront of really talking about and doing work in physics, cosmology, AI. Even though I live in Silicon Valley still, it's hard.
Well, I don't think there's anything common about you, but certainly I understand the desire to get in touch with these questions, and that not everybody's life and job and everything really lets them do it the way that I'm privileged to be able to do it professionally. But that's why I wrote the book. I wanted to share a little bit entryway, a little open door into that set of questions to as many people as I could.
Well, you would be amazed at how in psychotherapy, a lot of these things come up for people, and a lot of people have tremendous amount of angst and don't have a larger sense of being in the world. Even though your book so beautifully points out that everything you think is true is probably not true on some level.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's show. To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.